So when Alex invited me to give the keynote, I hesitated for a very, very long time about which keynote I exactly was going to give, because I know that Strange Loop, is the audience likes very techy, very geeky things, and that was the kind of talk that I gave when I was here the other time. And in fact, the second edition of my book was out, late last year, but given everything that is going on, I just could not get myself motivated to just pretend that nothing is happening and give a happy, techie talk. So I just decided to go meta a little bit. I hope you forgive me. This is a talk about the future of conferences and also about the past of conferences. I have some first-hand insights on organizing conferences, and in particular on organizing conferences online for a while, even before the pandemic. So that's my talk is going to be sort of a personal perspective on the lessons learned and sort of the big picture of conferences. So here we go. I'm going to let this go a little bit. I'm going to stop talking and let these old people tell the story. Okay, so that's a little intro to my talk. The talk is in 5 parts. I'll talk just a little bit about the origins of conferences, the value of conferences, the costs, the pandemic, and what I see as the future of this thing that we are doing here. So I did a little research on this interesting site, very geeky history site called the Scholarly Societies Project in the University of Waterloo. And so they map out all of these professional and scholarly societies throughout history, well, in the Western world at least. And so the oldest one is in 1323, some obscure society in France. And then throughout those, 200 years or something, 250 years or something like that, there were 30 documented. Then things started accelerating. So there's 43 between 1600 and 1700, 229 in the next 100 years, and then 230 in the next 50 years. So things started accelerating. There's more and more interest and activity around sharing knowledge and sharing professional and scholarly knowledge. So at the same time, not by coincidence, there was also the printing press that appeared in the 15th century in Europe. And of course, in the beginning, it was highly censored, but at some point, with this thirst for knowledge dissemination, some of these societies started playing a crucial role in disseminating scholarly and professional technical knowledge in the form of these journals that they would publish and send out to centers of knowledge known as universities. So this is another book that another very geeky history book that lists all of the scientific serials since something until 18 something. This was done by somebody who lived at the end of the 18th century, of the 19th century. So this is another interesting thing that maps out, the explosion of these activities of knowledge dissemination and knowledge sharing. And then, of course, closer to where we are, there's some famous conferences that happened. For example, the Solvay conferences in the early 20th century with a bunch of physicists that got together. This is all very famous people. You might recognize, Einstein, Marie Curie, some over there. And the same group of people a few years later, this was in 1927, a little older, grayer hair, which is sort of like us, I guess, when we also go to conferences over the years and we get a little older. So there's a long history of people sharing knowledge in person, go to a place and share some professional interests together. And even closer, in 1968, there was the famous NATO software engineering conferences where the term software engineering was coined. That also gathered a bunch of famous, people that started, kind of contributed to the start of the field of software engineering. This is an incomplete list of conferences that I either attended or talked or organized. I'm more on the academic side, so the academic side is a little beefier than the industry side. But I don't know about you guys, but conferences for me is a big part of my professional identity. I identify with the conferences that I help organize, the communities that go there every year, that we get older together. I made lifelong friends in conferences. It's absolutely a crucial part of my professional identity, at least. So let me pivot here to the value of conferences, right? And that's a personal perspective, and I think it will resonate with some of your experiences too. What value, reflecting back, what value do I see in these conferences that I attended throughout my career? And my career spans more or less like this. And I attended my first conference in 1992. And now we're in 2021, so we're about 30 years out. But I was going to put something here, but there's something very big happened here. And that was the internet and the web, right? Things exploded exponentially in terms of content that is available at my fingertips, ways that we communicate with each other around the globe. So my timeline of my value, the value that I see in conferences has changed, dynamically. It has not been just one thing from the beginning. There are many things that have changed over the years. So the first value, I think, is the value that the people in the 16th century already had in mind, which is knowledge sharing and acquisition. That's the main reason for organizing conferences. And I don't know about you, but for me, the value that I see in this, in knowledge sharing and acquisition in conferences decreased sort of sharply as the amount of content on the web has increased sharply. I mean, no offense to anybody, including me, who gives fantastic talks here, but there's lots of interesting videos already out there, and even more are produced almost every day. So there's lots of content out there on the web that I can watch, with a glass of wine in my home, with my slippers, and no need to travel to have the exposure to knowledge sharing. The goal of knowledge sharing, you don't need to travel these days. This has really been a major shift from when I remember 30 years ago. 30 years ago, if I wanted to get acquainted with the latest and greatest research or the latest and greatest technology, I had to go to a conference. And these days, that's not the case. That is not the case. So things have changed. The second value is networking, so social networking, meeting new people. And that has been incredibly valuable for me. But again, it has been sort of decreased. It was very valuable when I was younger. It was even more valuable sometime in my mid-career. And then as I got a little older, things sort of started not being so interesting, but also because it's actually easy to meet people online too. I've made a lot of new collaborators and even companies with people that I met online that I never met in real life. So that has changed too. Yes, we still meet lots of interesting people in conferences, but it's not the only place that we meet interesting people. We can also meet interesting people online without having to travel. So that has kind of decreased for me. Another value is paid breaks in nice places. And that definitely has not decreased. That's never gets old. So that's one of my main motivations to attend conferences is to go to these nice places, and that's exactly the business tourism is exactly caters to people like us because we need a break, right? And furthermore, if our employer is paying, it's so much the better, right? It's a way of knowing the world, traveling around the world, meeting interesting people, and you don't need to pay. And it's a wonderful perk from an employer if you can get those kinds of perks. So that never goes away. So I don't know about you, those are the three values that I got out of conferences, and I still get some of them. They changed over time. What about the costs? So again, it's a personal perspective. What are the costs of attending conferences? And here's again my timeline, and things have also changed quite irregularly over time. So one is the cost of time away from my family, which in the beginning was actually zero or even decreasing because I did not have really a family until the point in which I had my daughter, and then suddenly things spiked. And as my daughter was younger, a young child, the cost of being away from her was really almost unbearable. And of course now she's almost going to college, so she doesn't need me anymore, so now that cost is gone. So there's this bump in my life. I guess many of you probably sympathize with this curve too. It's irregular. The second one, sort of micro, I don't know what to call it. There's some sort of a background, sort of harassment when you're part of certain categories of people. That happens when you have a large crowd. The behavior in crowd sometimes is a little weird, the dynamics. And so that has always been sort of a little kind of nagging, annoying thing of attending conferences. But again, for me, it has decreased also because I'm getting older, but also because I just don't care, basically. I stopped caring. That's basically what is going on. But when you're younger and you don't know, it can be a big problem. It can be a big cost. As you're getting more experience, then you can start to just ignore. The third cost is one that I had completely ignored, or I was not even aware for the most part of my career. And I guess that's probably true with many of you here. And this is a topic that only really started kind of flashing in our eyes more recently, the topic of climate change and sustainability, and the topic of our own carbon emissions. So, sometime over the past 10 years, I guess, that's when I really started paying attention. I started doing changes in my lifestyle to mitigate my own personal carbon emissions. So I installed solar panels in my house. I drive an electric car. I try to be a nice citizen. But there's this thing that no matter what, I have solar panels, but then I travel to St. Louis, and there goes my carbon budget for a whole year. Because airplane travel is really a very unsustainable and very dirty business, basically. And so this is a cost. It's a personal cost for those who care, I guess. I do care, and it's not like the cost was nothing and then it was a lot. It's just my awareness of this cost was nothing. And then suddenly I became aware of this, and I started kind of giving a value to the cost of traveling to conferences and becoming, quite concerned about what is going on. So air travel is, when you travel to these conferences, is unavoidable. Jet fuel is difficult to replace, and you basically waste a lot of carbon emissions. You do make a lot of carbon emissions just by the fact of getting on an airplane and flying here. And there are calculators out there that you can use to tell you what the carbon footprint of a trip from A to B in the world is. So just, let me just expand a little bit on climate change and conferences, because it was something that really started really nagging me at some point in my life of how much, I was doing all these optimizations at home, but then the world is professional travel that was completely exploding, making all my optimizations at home pretty much irrelevant. So this is, my own CO2 emissions due to air travel. I counted from 2015 until 2019, before the pandemic, how many trips I did, on an average, what's my carbon emissions, and basically, in my estimate is that for the past 20 years, I probably was responsible for 330 tons of CO2, which first, I got to this number and said, what does this mean? So is this a lot? Is this a little? What is going on? So I started, again, doing a little bit of research to try to illuminate myself about what this means. And this is the best picture that I could come up with, is that if you have a tree growing for 40 years, okay, you have a tree growing for 40 years, it's taking CO2 out of the atmosphere and storing it. Trees are basically storage, CO2 storage, that's what they are. And then if you take a tree that's been there for 40 years and you burn it, you're basically releasing all that CO2 back to the atmosphere. So, and a normal, kind of a medium-sized tree, something like that, for 40 years, it corresponds more or less on average for a ton, 1 ton. So basically, in my 330 tons is basically 330 40-year-old trees. I'm burning a forest. I've burned a forest, and it's just not nice. So it's not nice. So in other words, costs, values, it's messy. It's not an easy picture. There's lots of reasons for continuing to do what we do, traveling to conferences, and there's lots of reasons for changing. It's not clear exactly what exactly was right, what's the sweet spot in here. And so we were discussing that before the pandemic, some colleagues and I at ACM, Special Interest Group in Programming Languages, we started a committee on conferences and climate change, like really trying to figure out, because ACM is one of those professional societies that organizes a lot of conferences, hundreds of conferences per year. SIGPlan itself, which is one small part of ACM, organizes, I don't know, I forget how many, like 16 conferences a year, something like that, every year. And so we started having this discussion internally of whether we should change anything or what should we do about climate change. And this is with Michael Hicks, Jens Palsberg, and Benjamin Pierce. We made a survey to the community. We brainstormed a lot. We wrote a report that's available through that link about what the options would be going forward for conferences in SIGPlan. We also wrote a communications of the ACM article just before the pandemic hit. It was in February 2020. And that article was basically just suggesting that the way to go at it, because the figure is so messy, there's so many pros and cons, that perhaps the best thing that we could do was just back off and just impose ourselves a tax. And the reason being that carbon and airplane travel and all that stuff, it's so cheap because essentially a lot of the fossil fuel industry is being subsidized. The real costs are not being passed on to the industry themselves, but they're being subsidized by means of, wars and security and all of that stuff. And so perhaps it's time that we voluntarily tax ourselves, since the governments seem not to want to do that. And so we would perhaps, when organizing conferences in the ACM, we would make things more expensive. And what we would do with the rest of the money, we would subsidize, climate change friendly activities, being, organization of local conferences or other things that people might want to do with that money. So that was sort of our position at the time before the pandemic hit. And then the pandemic hit. But so the possible actions would be, first of all, also in that report, the first thing that we need to do is to quantify, like how much really is what's the carbon footprint of Strange Loop? It's possible to actually estimate. It's not exact science, but as estimates, you can figure out where people are coming from, run the CO2 calculator, figure out other sustainability indicators from the venue here, and you can kind of have an estimate for what's the carbon footprint here. And we did that exercise for a collection of SIGPlan conferences for the past 10 years. We had the data, the attendance data. And so we did we ran the statistics, we saw, exactly what was going on. I could go into details, but basically it's the same messy picture, right? Because when, we organize conferences all over the world. So sometimes the conferences are in Paris, other times they are in Japan, other times they are in India or in the US, they're all over the world. And it's very clear from the numbers that whenever we go away from that axis of North America, Europe, Eastern North America, Western Europe, if we get away from that axis, the carbon footprint is much higher. That's rule of thumb. So there's a sweet spot around, Paris, London kind of thing, and then Boston, New York, Pittsburgh kind of thing. That is the sort of the minimum. But once we start going more to the west or more to the east or more to the south, the carbon footprint increases of the conferences. That's sort of the rule of thumb. But it's important to know. Okay, we have to know. We have to start quantifying these things. So another thing that we could do would be offer carbon offsets upon registration, but carbon offsets are sort of an iffy kind of thing. Not everybody agrees that they're a good solution. Rethinking PC meetings, and I'm almost embarrassed to talk about this because it's a very academic thing. It's just a very stupid thing. Thank God the pandemic got rid of all the in-person PC meetings. There's no more in-person PC meetings anymore. These are like meetings where the program committee would fly just to decide which papers were going to be accepted. Okay, that was what PC meetings are. So incremental changes, small incremental changes to conferences or deeper changes to conferences. We had a long list of other things that we could do. And then that implement the carbon tax was the thing that we kind of just decided to write on the communications of the ACM article. All right, and then the pandemic hit, and now we had, for better or for worse, voluntarily or involuntarily, we have 18 months of experience in virtual events and virtual conferences. So this was kind of a rush, and it was a scramble in the beginning. I was involved in organizing ACM conferences at the time. I was called up to create sort of an emergency task force in the ACM to figure out, because the ACM, there were like 170 conferences that the ACM was planning with contracts signed, right? There was contract signed already that year with venues and stuff. So they were scrambling to figure out, like, do we cancel everything? Do we go online? What's going on? So we wrote a kind of a best practices guide for organizing virtual conferences. And then the conference that I was organizing, ICSI 2020, they called me up to be the virtualization chair. I ended up actually coding a whole platform myself with John Bell to support the conference, the virtual conference. And that was the beginning of Clouder. We called it Clouder. And then throughout that summer last year, more conferences in the ACM wanted to use that platform. We made the platform available, but obviously we are academics, so we could not sustain that. But Luckily, then at some point in the fall, one person that we met in the conference that we organized volunteered to actually take over and start creating a business out of Clowder. And so we formed a company called Clowder, which is a company, community interest company, which is sort of a non-profit in the UK. So basically, which is a company that operates Clowder being an open source project. So there were more virtual conferences on Clowder throughout the spring and the winter, and we recently renamed the product MeetSpace app. Clowder is still the company, but the product is called MeetSpace. So there's lots of things that happen, and lots of experience, lots of virtual conferences, lots of interesting experimentations ourselves with the platform to figure out what exactly works better, what doesn't work, what seems to have more engagement, what seems to have less engagement. So it was an interesting time for experimenting. So here's some lessons learned, and we still don't know. There's lots of things that we still don't know, but here are some things that we already know with respect to virtual conferences, that video presentations actually are better than in person. And the reason being that there's a lot less technical snafus. People are a little more relaxed when they are shooting themselves and they're not talking in front of a crowd. And then there's also the part for the people watching, you can watch at your own time, so you can replay later. There's all sorts of things that you can do if you have the video. You have a permanent archival artifact that you can watch, you can disseminate around the world. It's much wider reach, so much bigger inclusion, right? You can, at least for for like academic conferences, we suddenly had the videos that were being watched in China, in China being always 10 times of the rest of the world, right? And that prior to, when we did not have videos, those people would be locked out. Those people would not have come to the conference. And so it really makes you think, we can reach a lot more people if we actually videotape the talks and make them available. Things for accessibility like closed captions and lip reading and all of that stuff is also better if you have the video. Now, we have a wonderful thing here of live closed captions. I was just talking with Alex. This is a great thing. And it requires a person for live captioning. But for videos, it doesn't require a person. You can do a fair amount with just translation after, in post-processing of the video. So there's lots of good reasons for actually doing video presentations. Live streaming is also possible. And it's technically perfectly fine. In fact, we're live streaming right now. The value of live streaming varies. That's what we found out. And the reason is that, again, when you go into the virtual space, people aren't necessarily on the same page, literally. So people may watch later. Right? Say they may be busy right now, but they want to watch a little later, an hour later, or something like that. So live streaming can be engaging. It's definitely more engaging because things can go wrong, right? But the value varies. There's also another problem with live streaming, which is one that we found out very quickly in the academic conferences that I tend to attend, which is that they have community around the world. And so we have to deal with time zones. We're awake here, but people in Australia are sleeping right now. And they get very upset, let me tell you, if you live stream only once a day in a way that is convenient for Americans and Europeans. So this is it's a very vocal community on the other side of the world that does not like that they are being forced to be expected to be awake in the middle of the night, and rightly so. Live Q&A, so there's the talk, and that's the thing that I say that actually works better in videos, but then there's the question and answering. Question and answering, the live, actually also works better, I think, in online than it works here for a number of reasons. For one, people can start already typing the questions even before the speaker is ended talking. The speaker can actually see the questions being typed as the speaker is speaking, or the video is playing. So there can be already an engagement as the talk is playing, and the speaker can see what the questions that are being asked and respond on the chat, for example. So we found many live Q&As to be quite engaging and more thoughtful. The questions were more thoughtful because people had more time to think about what they were going to ask. So this definitely, for video sharing, for value number one, knowledge sharing, there are lots of interesting, good things about going online with the conferences. And, you have sort of this experience that again, it's, a video, you know how to play it, you can stop, you can be interrupted by your kid, come back again, it's still there, you didn't miss anything, so that's a good thing. The networking, the social networking in virtual conferences ranges from non-existent to okay-ish. And I have not found a platform, including Meetspace, where it's a great experience. No, we're not there. Nobody's there yet. It's not a great experience, the social part of online conferences. On the other hand, it's very clear that the platform matters, and there's a very big difference from doing a webinar, a Zoom webinar or whatever, and using some of these newer platforms like Meetspace and others that pay attention to the interaction between the participants. So supporting interaction between participants, supporting, having the bios on there available, having tags, emoticons, live interaction, all of that matters for the engagement. So social rooms, shuffle rooms, sponsor booths, all stuff that can be thought of and designed and placed in the platform that can actually improve things. Still not as great as in-person social networking, but not as bad as like a webinar kind of thing. A webinar is like the worst, like the baseline, the bad baseline of these things. So you can start up video rooms. People can start up their own video rooms. They can be public, private. There's all sorts of things that can be designed and are being designed by all of these, Meetspace and other platforms that are experimenting in this space. Paid breaks is a total fail. Okay, so first of all, you are being paid because you're expected to be at work, but you don't have a break. You're expected to still do your normal job and then, watch the talks, and this is a complete fail. This is just not gonna work. If we're ever going to organize conferences online for reals, this needs to be rethought, because there's no way that people can have the mental cycles to have 8 hours of work and then watch 4 hours of videos. It's not going to work. So this has been quite a challenge. On the other hand, which is sort of the other side of the same coin, is that the time away from family is a total win, because you don't leave home. So you can stop the video and give food to your daughter, and come back again, and so it's great. This part was great, so there's no cost. The harassment cost, there's fewer opportunities, also great. There's a lot less opportunities for harassment. In fact, we haven't seen any harassment, at least in the conferences that have been done in Meetspace. We haven't seen anything of that sort. And for carbon emissions, it's also a total win. So this is, and I will expand a little bit more on this, but it's clear that virtual conferences have a much lower carbon footprint than in-person conferences. So lessons learned, the overall experience with respect to knowledge sharing in the environment, because this is online, because we can produce videos, it's part of that same story of the content that exists online, right? So it's pretty good. It's pretty good. With respect to the expectations of a conference, the social parts, the serendipity, bumping into other people, that ranges from terrible to okay-ish. And where the platforms matter, so there seems to be a lot of interesting new designs in here that may be coming up and people are experimenting with. Hopefully this will get better. But another thing that we also learned, and this is one of the hardest lessons to tell the organizers of this conference, is that the organizational decisions matter a lot. I mean, just in mid-space, we've had conferences that were not good at all, and we had conferences that were actually pretty good, and the platform is exactly the same, didn't change. And why? Because the organizers had a completely different way of designing the conference. You know, the kinds of things, activities that they had attendees doing, you know, the time zones distributions, smaller, meaningful, small group interactions versus not even thinking about it. It's like a huge spectrum of decisions that the organizers can now have to make. And what happens for a lot of these organizers is that they don't even know that they have now all of these options. And so they don't even think. They just think, okay, it's just like a Zoom meeting or whatever. And they don't think about all the other things that they probably should be thinking, and things fall flat. Whereas we've had other conferences where the organizers were really thoughtful and engaged and thinking up front about how things were going to enroll online. And those conferences were absolutely really, they were not as good as in-person conferences, but they were pretty good. So that matters a lot. So let me just make a little detour here about a pre-pandemic case study of a virtual conference. That's the Open Simulator Community Conference, which is something that I have been involved for the past, N years. And the conference started in 2013, and it's a virtual conference, has always been a virtual conference, because this is a virtual community, a worldwide virtual community. This is a virtual environment, like a 3D kind of thing. If you guys remember Second Life, it's sort of the same client code of Second Life. The server was completely redone. I'm one of the developers of the server, but it provides the same kind of environment. So, at some point we decided to organize this annual community conference, and so these are people who are aficionados of these kinds of environments. We made a whole conference venue with conference rooms, plenary rooms like this one, poster sessions, you name it, expo areas. But of course, it's being virtual reality, you can get a little wilder than just the constraints of the real world. And there's also social events. There's people doing live streaming, live music, and that other people put their avatars dancing and stuff like that. So, but again, this is a community that already lives for this, so they know this. They don't need to be taught about these kinds of environments. So the learning curve here is none for them. But OSC numbers, it's 2 days, usually typically a weekend. There has been one every year. The next one is in December. About 500 people every year. Dozens of speakers, many satellites events. It's a real conference, except that it has always been online. And the stack is that, there's a Second Life viewer, and then there's the Open Simulator server on the back end, which is a server that actually runs on one of my physical servers at UCI, which is a Dell PowerEdge, an old one. And the viewers are run on regular laptops. So I tried to make an estimate for the carbon footprint of OSCC. And I did best as I could, and I guess this is just an estimate. But I was looking at the specs for energy consumption and carbon emissions of the server, and that's what I found, about 18 kilos per week. So assuming that we are testing on the server for a week or whatever, this is very high because there's more stuff running on that server. But so 18 kilos for that week of the conference. For the participants' laptops, again, I was looking at the specs online, about 40, these are the numbers that I ran into. So if we have 500 participants for 2 days, it's about a total of 120 kilos for the whole thing. Thank you. Thanks. And then the network traffic, that one I could not find any good documentation. And I don't know if anybody knows. I'd be glad to have a better estimate. But, just complete a number out of my back pocket, 500 kilos, half a ton, just for sending the packets around the world through the servers. So basically, we have a total CO2 emissions of less than a ton. And I think this is very high, actually. I think this is a very high estimate. 750 for the whole thing, 500 people, right? So compare that with the carbon emissions of a conference with 500 people flying all over the world with an average of, I don't know, a ton just on airfare, on the air travel, plus the hotels that are not very efficient and stuff like that. So it's a big difference. That's the bottom line. It's a lot lower, like a lot, several orders of magnitude lower. So this is a good thing. So the future. I wish I had a crystal ball, but I don't. Some predictions. So I think that in-person events will not go away. There's clear indication that people are eager to go back to normal. And I don't know if we'll ever go back to normal, but I think we will go back to some new normal. I can see it already in my lectures in the university that we went back to the classroom, but it's not the same thing. We are doing recordings. We are allowing students to watch the lectures, later on. There's all sorts of hybridization going on. It's not the same thing. And I suspect that's going to happen the same with conferences, that people are eager to resume the normal, but the normal is not going to be the same. And virtual participation is here to stay. I think there's early signs that there is a strong demand for it. Not just because of concerns with the pandemic or whatever, but because people actually have, those bumps of children, for example, they cannot travel, or they have something in their work that they cannot really leave, but they really want to see what's going on in the conference, and so there's demand for it. So hybrid, and nobody really knows what this means, and there are many modes of hybrid. So one possible version of hybrid is that lots of large online events and a few smaller physical ones. So, for having more meaningful interactions, you have it in smaller groups, at least in academic world. Okay? Small workshops tend to be more worthwhile than the large conferences. Or it can be the other way around, lots of small online events and then fewer very large conferences, like, instead of SIGPlan having 17 conferences every year, maybe we should just organize one large conference per year, just one. And then everything else should be an online event, for example. Or could be alternating between online and physical. So one year it's online, another year it's going to be physical. So we could go hybridization that way, or you could go hybridization the hard way, which is what Alex is trying to do here this year, which is that you are catering both for in-person attendees and online attendees at the same time. So you basically have the double of the work because you're organizing two events, really, and probably the double of the costs too. Because again, you are organizing two events. So these are all the possibilities. I don't know where the chips will fall, but I am pretty sure that normal is not going to be normal again. It's going to be something slightly different, and online events are here to stay, and online content is here to stay with respect to the organization of conferences. So it's a time to think. What do we value? What costs are we willing to incur? And moreover, how can we leverage technology to innovate in this 1.3 trillion space, which is the business tourism space? And basically beyond faster horses, and faster horses here mean basically doing what we were already doing in the 16th century, except now that with a lot more people, everybody coming from all over the world, and basically the same thing, but just bigger, right? can we go beyond that metaphor? What other interesting things what other forms of conferencing can we envision, perhaps leveraging technology that will create something different? It's not the same thing, but something different, but something more worthwhile and more modern in a way. So let me tell you the challenges. Technology is the easy part, actually, as we very quickly found out developing Clouder. The pieces are all there. You know, live streaming, they're very good platforms for live streaming. AWS has a fantastic infrastructure for live streaming applications built on top of it. You know, text chatting, live interaction, all of that stuff, it's fun to develop, it's super fun to develop, and the technology is not the problem. Technology is already there. The challenges are all social and psychological. And those are the ones that are really difficult, that we're struggling, because the sense of presence is something that we don't even realize, but that's what we bump into when we are placed in, or displaced in a foreign space like here. And we are present, we don't even realize it, that we are present, we know that we are here, right? I can see you, you can see me, we are here. I'm not at home. And the fact that I am surrounded by these walls and this hotel is always a reminder that I'm in some non-usual place, and this is a special event. Whether if I'm at home, sitting in my office, it's really difficult to remember that I'm attending a conference. There's a disconnect. I'm there. I'm at home, right? I'm not at the conference, but my mind wants to be at the conference, but my eyes are not at the conference. So the mental space is a problem, you know, also because you're perhaps sometimes you're interrupted by your kids, by your spouse, and that's, it's difficult to, which is something that doesn't happen when you travel, when you are here. You're automatically not interrupted. Time zones are a problem for certain conferences. And also many people are actually quite reluctant in interacting online. They just don't like it. Many people just don't like to interact online. Maybe those people will eventually die very soon, I don't know. But the newer generation seems to be a lot more comfortable with these things. But I actually know a lot of people who don't like to interact online. So these are the challenges, and I don't know what's going to happen, but some of this may go away. Imagine this thought experiment. So imagine that you have a pandemic that lasts 20 years, that you have the 2020 year that lasts 20 years, that you can't travel. Or imagine that you have prohibitively expensive air travel and you can't travel, which might happen, you know, if we stop subsidizing the fossil fuel industry. What would happen? Would we regress to the 16th century and everything would become local and we would, you know, break our global connections? I don't think so. I think that given from what we saw this last year, how quickly everybody was able to pivot to functioning online, I think that we would be able to figure out a way of making these conferences work online. You know, the extra steps that we need to do to make these events interesting as an online experience. I think it will happen. Now, if everybody starts to say, oh, no, I don't want to go there, let's go back to travel, you know, let's go back to in-person, then that, you know, this may not happen until it actually, one of those nasty things forces us to solve the problem. So I'll leave you with these thoughts. I wish I had more answers, but I actually have a lot of questions, interesting observations about what I saw working, what I saw not working, and I hope that we will find a way of finding a middle point between this very unsustainable way of life and something that continues to be worthwhile and professionally fulfilling. Thank you.